Thank you so much for the honor and the privilege and the pleasure of being here today with you. The kind words that were said, I appreciate them. Fact is, some of them were even true, some of them. But here are some things that are unequivocally true. Unequivocally true. I, like many of you, am a son of the South. I, like many of you, was raised up from the sacred soil of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I, like many of you, will return to that same sacred soil when my time on earth is up. I've lived in over 30 places in my life. In fact, I've lost count. It'll take me a while to recount all the places I've lived. I've been in 49 states and a number of countries. My wife, Janet, and I, being here in this part of the world, in this best area of the best country, is by choice and it is not by chance. We chose to move here, we chose to live here, and we have chosen to remain here. I, like many of you, am the son of a patriot. I, like many of you, come from a family of patriots. I look at my father's generation, and I go out horizontally, and then I go back vertically, far back as I can go. Men have served their country, served it well, dedicated, loyal, committed, and some actually paid the ultimate sacrifice, as have members of your family. I want to talk about two solemn obligations that I believe that we have as citizens of this greatest of all nations. Two solemn obligations. And the first I'm going to tee up was something that I experienced over 40 years ago. My father and I were standing in our backyard one day talking, and I was 14 or 15 years old. And he said to me, "Steve, when you become an adult, you'll notice one day that there'll be a group of men standing around talking about their service in the military. And if the subject does turn to that subject of serving, if there's someone standing there who did not serve, he'll have a reason. He'll almost be defensive about it, even if it was a perfectly good reason. But he'll almost be defensive about not having served." And he said to me, "I believe that's the case because I believe that our nation writes her call on the hearts of her young men." Now that was 40 years ago. That's two generations. My father was almost 40 years older than I was, so he goes back 4 generations. He was born during World War I. I hope today that our nation still writes her call on the hearts of her young people to serve, and I hope that our young people continue to answer the call. So the first solemn obligation I believe we have as citizens is to serve our nation in the military. So I would ask you to sign up, to join up, and to serve. I don't mean drop out of high school to do it. If you're not going to go to college, finish your high school, but serve. And if you're going to go to college, maybe you ought to consider going on an ROTC scholarship. Or if you have your degree, maybe you can go to OCS and get a commission. But I would say, please serve. Serve. And if you're not able to serve, then I ask you to serve those who have served, or serve those who are serving today. There are 1,000 ways to do that. The other solemn obligation I believe we have as citizens is to know and to learn, to find out about the stories of service and commitment and loyalty and dedication and sacrifice to our country that emanate from our own families. Learn the stories of our relatives who have served, commit the stories to memory, and share the stories, not just in your family, but with other people of your generation and younger. Never forget their stories. We have to tell the stories. We have to continue to teach Americans what it means to serve and what the price of freedom is. If we go back to 1945, there were about 140 million Americans, less than half of what we have today, 140 million. During the course of World War II, there were 16.1 million men and women who served in the military during that period of World War II. That's more than 10% of the population. And if you look at the population between, say, 17 and 35 or 40, 16 million must be a third of that population. I didn't read the statistics, but it must have been a third or a quarter of everybody in America served in the military. So at that time, Americans knew the price of freedom. It knew the cost of liberty. It knew the price of independence because it sacrificed, it participated in that great war. Every single family was touched by World War II. That's not the case today. We have over 300 million Americans. So the percent that are serving in the military today is a tiny percent. We cannot let our nation forget the sacrifice, the dedication, what it takes to remain free. We have to keep the stories alive because as fewer and fewer people serve in the military as a percent of our population, fewer and fewer of our elected officials at the county level, the state level, the national level, fewer of them serve, fewer of them understand that if we lose our freedom and independence, we will not get it back. And if America loses its freedom and its independence, the entire world that is free today will be free no longer. Because we as Americans carry the banner of freedom throughout the world, and there's no doubt about that. So we need to know the stories, and we need to share the stories. And in that vein, I'm going to share a story with you. And I'm going to call it my Uncle Joe story for a simple reason. It's about my uncle, and his name was Joe. To share this story, I'm going to take you back 22 years with me. I'm going to take you to a family reunion we held in the early 90s, and it was in Beckley, West Virginia, because my parents were from Beckley, and many of their relatives were from Beckley before they scattered throughout the country. So our reunion started on Friday, and here we are on Saturday night. And we're in this big room in the hotel, and we're having a banquet and a meal, and people are talking about the reunion. So during the course of the meal, several relatives go up, talk about the reunion, and then the last person goes up to speak. He was my cousin, Joseph Patrick O'Neill Jr., my mother's side. Pat was 11 years older than I am. So 22 years ago, he was a middle-aged man. So a middle-aged man walks to the podium, and as he walks up there, he has something in his right hand, a package. I could not tell what it was because it was covered with old brown wrapping paper. But there was something in his hand. He walks to the podium, he turns, he faces the rest of us, and he says, I'd like to spend a few minutes sharing with you the reunion I recently had with my father. His father was Joseph Patrick O'Neill. The father was called Joe, the son was called Pat. So Pat was going to talk about a reunion he had with his father Joe. In most cases, there's nothing remarkable about that, except those of us who were sitting there who were adults and we knew the story, we knew that Uncle Joe had been killed in World War II about 50 years earlier. He was a bomber pilot stationed in England, and he was shot down someplace over Germany. The body was never recovered. And if I remember correctly, I do not believe that the father ever saw the son. The son was born while the father was overseas. So we wondered how in the world could a son meet the father who'd been dead for about a half a century? How could that happen? How it happened was what Pat was holding. You see, Uncle Joe, Pat's father, kept a diary in World War II. Kept a diary. And he made one of his buddies in England promise that if anything happened to him, he would get the diary to his brother. His brother was Jack O'Neill. Uncle Jack also served as a bomber pilot in World War II. A lot of missions. He came back in one piece. Joe did not. His buddy took his diary back to America and had it for many years, if not decades. But eventually he was able to find Uncle Jack, who was in Long Island, New York at the time. He got the diary to Uncle Jack. Uncle Jack received it. Yes, there was a letter that conveyed it. Uncle Jack knew it was a diary. And he could never bring himself to open and read the words his brother had written during World War II. And so it remained locked up for years, if not more decades, until just before this reunion. And Pat was visiting Uncle Jack, and Uncle Jack said, "Pat, I've got a diary that your father kept in World War II. You need to have it." So Pat took the diary back with him. He was living in Huntsville, Alabama. He sat down. He opened the package. He opened the diary. And he met his father. So we had a middle-aged man, the son, reading the words his father had written a half a century before, when his father was almost still a boy himself, 20, 21, 22 years old. The contrast was overwhelming of the two. The eloquence and the syntax and the grammar with which Uncle Joe wrote was astounding. It was so clear. He talked about the missions they went on. He talked about the close buddies of his that died, didn't come back. And in those pages, Uncle Joe commenced the debating of the greatest and most important question that any man or woman serving in the military ever has to deal with. And it's this question: is it right to take the lives of other human beings? Is it right to kill other human beings? Is it right? Not lawful, but is it right? And how will you be judged? That's not an unusual question. You can go across America this week, and you will find colleges, universities, you'll find a professor of political science or philosophy, and he'll be leading a class and debating that question. Is it lawful to take the lives of other human beings? But you see, when you're in college, it's an academic question. The professor has probably never taken up arms. The students probably never have, probably never will take up arms. And they don't have to live with the consequences. Uncle Joe had to live with the consequences. He had to live with the consequences of what he did for eternity. And this was a young man who was deeply religious and moral, a fine son, a friend, a husband. And he had to wrestle with the answer. Because he knew that the bombs they dropped fell not only on other soldiers, fell not only on factories making military items for war, but they fell on churches, and they fell on schools, and they fell on homes. His bombs could not help but fall on old men and women and young boys and girls. His bombs could not help but fall on nursing mothers with babies at their breasts. He knew that. He realized that. So he had to struggle with the question. And he came to this answer. Sometimes it is necessary to take other people's lives when you're fighting a greater evil. When you're trying to save more people. So he lived the answer. And he was at peace with himself. And as his words were read, my father was on my left, my mother was on my right at the table. My father had to get up and walk around. You see, he loved Uncle Joe like a brother. And for the first time in my life, I saw the strongest, toughest man I've ever seen in my life cry. I looked for my mother. She was sitting at a table with her brother, my Uncle Jack, and her sister. And they were sitting there holding each other, and their eyes are full of tears. And when I looked into their eyes, I saw not the eyes of elderly people. I saw the eyes of two young sisters and a young brother who were meeting their brother again after a half a century. And I saw how much they missed him and how much they loved him. And in their eyes, I saw the price of freedom. After a half a century, they were still paying the price for our freedom. As Pat continued to read Uncle Joe was facing a new year, and he pondered what it would bring. And then he said, when we win over here, when we defeat Hitler, not if, when we defeat Hitler, he said, I'm going to go home for a little while. I'm going to take 30 days leave. I'm going to get to know my wife again, and I'm going to meet my son. And when that 30 days is up, I'm going to volunteer, and I'm going to the Pacific, and I'm going to fight the Japanese, because we have to win this war. Everything is at stake. Shortly after that, Uncle Joe lost his life. His remains were not recovered, as far as I recall. So where he is today is known only to God. He never got to meet his son. But his son met the Father through the words the Father wrote. So we have a solemn obligation to keep those stories alive, because the lips of those who made eternal sacrifice are now quiet. Our lips are the ones that must speak. We must tell the story. That's my Uncle Joe story. You've got your own Uncle Joe story. Or Brother Joe, or Cousin Joe, or Father Joe, or Great-Grandfather Joe, or Husband Joe. And today, with women answering the call of duty and serving, not only do we have Uncle Joe stories, we have an Aunt Joanne story, or a Sister Joanne story. And we are duty bound to share those stories. We cannot forget this price of freedom. If we do, that flame is extinguished, and no one will be able to relight it for us. Now, for those who served in the military, if you served, we want to recognize you. Please stand. If you were married to someone who served, please stand. And if you cannot stand, raise your hand. Let us again recognize you and thank you. Thank you. For those of you who served in the Vietnam War, I have a couple of special words I want to share with you. A lot of you guys got a raw deal. Not in going over there. I read a statistic said 91% of the people who served in Vietnam were glad they served. And 74% of those men and women would go back today, even knowing how it would turn out. That's commitment. But during that war, there were Americans who turned their back on our military. They spat upon them upon their return, cursed them, called them vile names. The shame is on those who did that. The shame is not on those who served. So I want to share with you two final words. Served in Vietnam. I hope you heard the words 40 years ago, but if you did not hear those words then, I'm going to give those words today. And I'm going to say the words loud enough that you're going to be able to hear me. Even those of you who served in the artillery and can't hear squat anymore, you're going to hear these words. So here they are. Welcome home. Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome home.